Hey there. So the podcast is currently on an extended hiatus so that I can write my next book and work on some other exciting projects. But while we're away, I hope you'll enjoy this fan favorite episode from the archives. If you want brand new content to help you make peace with food and heal from diet culture, come sign up for my free weekly newsletter at christyharrison.com/newsletter, where I answer a weekly listener question. And as always, if you join my Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course at christyharrison.com/course, you get access to our exclusive monthly Q&A podcast where I answer all your new questions. Just go to christyharrison.com/newsletter and christyharrison.com/course to sign up, or click the links in the episode description. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths toward peace with food in their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 246 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with eating disorders therapist and fellow podcaster Asher Pandjiris about chronic illness in the context of body acceptance, living with an autoimmune disorder, the intersection of eating disorders and trauma, how the personal responsibility narrative perpetuates stigma, how being queer and non-binary has affected Asher's relationship with their body, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment, but first I'll answer this week's listener question. It's from a listener with initials EKG who writes, "Hi, Christy. I was just listening to episode 196 about diet culture's racist roots, and in the first part where you answer the listener question, I found myself following along and agreeing until you said the key is no restrictions, and then I felt myself deny that. I think a good amount of that defense for restrictions comes from an internalized diet culture, but in creating my defense in my head, I went to my Jewish dietary customs of kashrut. There are restrictions like no mixing milk and meat, no pigs or other animals with split hooves that I know are antiquated and I've heard came about from an anthropology kind of perspective as rules designed for health and cleanliness 6,000 years ago. But there's also a moral and spiritual aspect to keeping kosher and a connection to Jews around the world. I'm working on taking in all aspects, but right now that seems daunting. Is the goal to come back to my Jewish roots once I understand that diet culture might exist within traditional dietary laws too, or to reinvent a modern kashrut? That seems like the best, but is still a structure, and intuitive eating dismantles structures around food. Thank you." So thanks, EKG, for that great question. And before I answer, just my standard disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only, aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice, and don't constitute a dietitian-patient relationship. So this is a great question, and I definitely have a number of thoughts that I hope will help you navigate this. I just want to say right up top that I have nothing against the traditions of kashrut or any religious practice when it comes to food, and that these traditions can absolutely be compatible with intuitive eating, and it is definitely tricky when you're first trying to recover from disordered eating, and it's easy for diet culture thinking to get mixed in with religious traditions, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Also, I just want to acknowledge here that I'll be speaking about this from an outsider perspective because I don't have any personal experience with keeping kosher. I do actually have one Jewish grandparent and one parent who's identified as Jewish or half Jewish at different points in their life, But I've never been religious myself. And even the Jewish family members that I know, because I have a gigantic extended family and have never even met some of the people on that side, but the family members that I spent time with growing up who were Jewish didn't keep kosher themselves either. So pretty much everything I've learned about the kashrut traditions has been from my Jewish clients and colleagues and friends who keep kosher or who grew up keeping kosher. So I just want to name that and say that I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I will share my thoughts on your question and pass along some of what I've learned about how intuitive eating can fit in with kashrut and give you some food for thought and some resources for more information. So with that said, I'd love to start by getting into the nuances of what I actually said in that podcast episode and that answer and what you heard, because I think the difference there actually holds some richness. So I listened back to the answer in episode 196, and I didn't hear anything saying no restrictions. So it's possible that maybe you're thinking of a different Q&A episode, although I generally try to stay away from blanket statements like no restrictions because there is so much nuance to this. But if it is indeed episode 196 that you're thinking of, I think it'll be helpful to sort of talk through these nuances here. So basically what I said in that episode is that it's important to allow yourself unconditional permission to eat as much as you want and need throughout the day. And that if you find yourself eating to the point of discomfort late at night, or really anytime, look for the hidden restriction that you might have been engaging in previously. Hidden restriction meaning trying not to eat or eating a smaller portion size, eating less than what you really want, and generally just putting your body in a state of famine, putting your body in a place where it feels like it's in a famine. And what I was talking about there was really restricting the amount that you eat and the times you allow yourself to eat, not necessarily what you eat, and definitely not cases when the what is governed by values that have nothing to do with diet culture or eating disorder rules, right? Because certainly when what you're allowing yourself to eat is governed by diet culture, then that can make you feel like you're in a famine, that can make you feel restricted. It can create psychological deprivation and feelings of restriction that, drive you to binge, maybe even in the absence of quote unquote physical hunger, although of course physical and mental hunger are so intimately connected, and trying to distinguish between them, I think, is a really fruitless practice in many ways. But, when you're in a place of diet culture thinking, disordered eating thoughts, being governed by eating disorder rules that are telling you what to eat, then that is definitely a driver of binging oftentimes. On the flip side, you're mentally restricting, and so then you end up binging as a response. That's not necessarily the case when the things governing what you eat are values that have nothing to do with diet culture's rules. So that is something to keep in mind, that just because you're keeping kosher, just because you're eating in line with those values, doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to drive you to binge or drive you to feel like you're out of control when eating, when you're exposed to non-kosher foods, right? It's all in how you relate to it. Now, that's talking about the restrictions on what, right? On what to eat. I know that some of the kosher traditions for certain occasions also place restrictions on the amount and the times you're allowed to eat, like Yom Kippur, for example. But we'll just sidebar that for a minute, because from your question, it sounds like what you're really talking about are the kosher traditions around what you eat. And so I think if you're hearing an answer like the one I gave in episode 196 about restrictions on when and how much you eat, and you're interpreting it to mean that you can't follow kosher practices around what you eat, that might be something to look at. Because I wasn't saying that kosher traditions automatically equal telling your body it's in a famine. But if you feel that way, then that's definitely important to investigate, right? If you feel like kosher traditions are making you feel psychologically restricted and leading to rebound binge eating or feeling out of control with food, that is something to examine. And I know that some people do start to feel very restricted by the kashrut customs about what to eat when they're recovering from disordered eating. And the interplay of kosher traditions and eating disorders is actually something that's often discussed. I think in part because there's a disproportionately high rate of eating disorders in the Orthodox Jewish community, and that's pretty well known among eating disorder professionals, or at least the ones in areas where we have a fairly large Orthodox population, like in New York, where I'm based. And so from what I understand from some of my colleagues, many rabbis actually understand the importance of lifting restrictions on eating for people who are in recovery from disordered eating. And they view food as medicinal during recovery and therefore provide permission to eat non-kosher during the recovery process. The idea being that recovery from disordered eating is a health issue, right? And that honoring your body is honoring God. And therefore, there's no reason to feel any guilt about not eating kosher while you're recovering because you're taking care of your health, you're taking care of your body and honoring God through your recovery. So EKG, I don't know how religiously observant you are apart from keeping kosher. I would imagine probably pretty observant. But you might see about consulting with a rabbi on this issue if it would help ease your mind. And I believe the particular exemption for disordered eating recovery is called a heter. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's in English, it's spelled Hetter. One of my colleagues told me about that. And so I think it happens more often than you'd think that people will get an exemption from keeping kosher while they're pursuing recovery. And I've even seen many Jewish clients of mine who don't keep kosher the rest of the year, don't keep kosher in general, but they get an exemption from fasting on Yom Kippur because that can be a huge disordered eating trigger too, the fasting. And even people who aren't super observant often feel a duty to fast on that high holiday. So, getting an exemption from a rabbi just to say, take care of yourself, you don't have to fast, is really liberating, I think, for a lot of people. So from what I've heard from Jewish clients and colleagues at various levels of observance, it seems like getting some kind of exemption is pretty common practice among Jewish people who are recovering from disordered eating. And you might see if just knowing that helps you feel more liberated around this issue, helps you feel more able to pursue intuitive eating. And you might also talk to a rabbi if that feels right to you to kind of get some more specific guidance. Regardless of what you ultimately decide about keeping kosher, remember that if it feels important to you to keep kosher, you can always go back to it down the line once you're feeling really solid in your recovery, and you can get an exemption while you're recovering. And if trying to keep kosher is harming your mental health right now, then that's something to really take seriously. And there's a lot of precedent for addressing these issues among communities that observe kashrut. I also wanted to give you some resources recommended by some of my Jewish colleagues so that you can get some more personalized help with these issues and, with your recovery as well. First, I don't know your gender identity from your question, but if you happen to be a woman, there's a group called Intuitive Eating and Body Positivity for Jewish Women that was founded by therapist and fellow intuitive eating coach Elisheva Dorfman and is moderated by some great Hayes folks, including friend of the pod, Shira Rosenbluth, who was on episode 216. So we'll link to that group in the show notes for this episode. It's Intuitive Eating and Body Positivity for Jewish Women. I think if you just search that on Facebook, it should come up. But we'll link to it in the show notes too. And then I'm not sure where you're located, but I think it could be helpful to have the support of a therapist and a dietitian as you're navigating this recovery process. I'll share a couple names and websites of providers in the community whom you can reach out to. And you can also write into my team. admin@christyharrison.com is our email address to inquire about a referral in a different location if you need it. So for therapists in New York, there is Shira Rosenbluth, whom I mentioned, and her website is shirarosenbluth.lcsw.com. And in Southern California, there's Elisheva Dorfman, whom I also mentioned, and her website is foodforthoughttherapy.com. For dietitians, there is Dina Cohen in New Jersey, and her website is eatwellsoonrd.com. And in Toronto, Canada, there's a dietitian named Atara Herzig-Fenig, and she's at ataranutrition.com. We'll put links to all these websites in the show notes too. And the show notes, you can get full show notes at christyharrison.com/246. And these are all folks that I either know personally or who have been recommended to me through my network of health at every size eating disorder recovery providers. So they're people that I feel confident recommending. The last thing that I'll say is that I noticed at the end of your question, you said reinventing a modern kashrut seems like the best, but is still a structure, and intuitive eating dismantles structures around food. And I just want to point out that intuitive eating actually doesn't mean tearing down all structures and having no structure at all with food. In fact, what it's really about is having your body and your brain work together to create a structure of what, when, and how much to eat that is adaptive and that is right for you, using information from your hunger and fullness cues, as well as your desires, your schedule, and practical considerations like what your day looks like, what food you have available, what finances you have available, your prior knowledge about the kinds of meals and snacks that help you feel satisfied and energized, and your culture and your values. So, intuitive eating is definitely compatible with non-diet culture related values and structures like the customs of kashrut. It's just going to take some work and some deep thinking to help make sure you're relating to kosher traditions in a way that isn't tangled up with diet culture and disordered eating, and may require you to temporarily get an exemption from keeping kosher while you're in the early stages of recovery so you can really let go of the ways in which diet culture did get tangled up with the kosher traditions. So I hope that's helpful. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That is christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it much more quickly, you can come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. The course has a monthly Q&A podcast just for course participants, where you get to ask your own questions every month and have me answer them, and listen to hundreds of answers I've given to other people already so that you can really work through all the nuances of intuitive eating, all the sticking points that might be coming up so that you can put it into practice in your own life. The course also has 13 modules of audio and written content talking you through the principles of intuitive eating, plus a private community forum just for course participants so that you can have daily guidance from my team and from me, as well as hundreds of other great people who are on the anti-diet path with you. One of them is a participant named Grace, who recently finished the course and had this to say about it. I feel more self-love and worth than I have in a long time because of this course. I've been able to practice the intuitive eating fundamentals. I just didn't feel confident or have the skills to do prior to this course, despite all the reading I had done. Thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of my heart for the gift of this course. I now feel confident in my ability to continue my intuitive eating journey. If you're ready to join Grace and break free from diet culture to reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Asher Pandjiris. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
I'm sure a lot of people say this, but it's a very good question. And I've really dug into this question over the past couple of weeks because I have an association with my food relationship growing up as very neutral. And I think in some ways I was lucky. I grew up in sort of the southern Midwest, and I was lucky to have a family that I would say that we almost had like, I don't want to say a transactional relationship with food. There was certainly pleasure in food. I would say there wasn't a lot of like curiosity or this could be fun or we could open up possibilities. It was very kind of standard fare. But my memories about growing up are that I'll just name from the jump that I definitely grew up with thin privilege, and I was an athlete. And so my relationship to food was often like food as fuel and also food as just food, like mealtimes, snacks. That was all just very normal in my household. And also in terms of the messaging I received. I did grow up with a mother who had a very different body shape and size from me. She's shorter and in a larger body than mine. And my father definitely, there was a lot of fat phobia and a lot of shaming of my mom around her body size. She was a healthy eater, meaning like she seemed to have a neutral relationship with food. It was more that she got a lot of, she was really, I witnessed her kind of having to take on some of that fat phobia and just the kind of like, you should exercise more, exercise your way out of this body size that you, to my mind, I mean, and it's been, she's had the same body for her whole life. I mean, and has a really relatively neutral, or from what I understand, neutral relationship to food. She certainly instilled that in us. And so I think that that was one of the things that just kind of made me aware that there were these, of course, there were these other discourses, and they did kind of come into my household through my dad. And also, I think my home relationship to food was a really nice place to counterbalance some of what was happening around me, especially like in junior high and high school with a lot of, I went to, an all girls Catholic school. And so there was a lot of orthorexia, a lot of competition between students and friends, and a lot of restriction. And so I think that was kind of like in the atmosphere, but because I had this thin privilege, it didn't affect me in the same way that it might have. And certainly if that was reinforced at home, I would have been in a different situation, I think.
Yeah. So you had this protection both of having a peaceful relationship with food modeled for you at home, and then also the thin privilege where nobody was criticizing the size and shape of your body.
Or questioning it. Yeah, of course. And, I think that the one thing that does come to mind when I think about my relationship with food, and this is something that, I certainly talk to my patients about, is not just the actual food nourishment piece, but the sort of atmosphere around the food. So that was not great in my childhood. And I remember specifically that, meal times were extraordinarily stressful because of I don't know, frankly, the sort of traumatic circumstances in which I was growing up, unrelated to food. And so I think that there was a lot of relational tension, and that does, I think, affect the state in which we're eating. Like if we're eating in a stressful environment, those early associations can be somewhat impactful. It's really nice as an adult with a child and to be able to kind of curate like a more fun and pleasant dinner time, or, that it's really to kind of counteract that feeling that I had around food.
That sounds like it was really stressful. And I wonder if that planted a seed for you for later issues with food, do you think? Or was that sort of just a separate thing?
It's something I'm interested in reflecting on. I can't imagine that it didn't impact me. I think it may have impacted how I related to eating, pleasure, and food. I guess that would be the thing, is that I think I started out by saying it was transactional. I really for a long time, until later in life, had a relationship where, it was like, okay, just get the dinner over with, or get the meal over with. And mostly because of either it being a fuel-based meal, like I was about to play a basketball game or whatever, or I wanted to get, out of these family and relational dynamics. And so I think that the work I've done over the years to kind of try to have curiosity and having meals with friends and having it be pleasurable and explore foods together and all of that kind of stuff has really been newer to me. And that's been really important.
Yeah, pleasure is so important.
Right. Right.
In all aspects of life, and especially in our relationship with food. But it's so interesting how the pleasure aspect gets stripped away from it in different ways for different people, for different circumstances.
For different reasons. Yeah. I remember when I was the program director at an eating disorder treatment facility, and I've worked in residential eating disorder treatment. And I really, on an emotional level, could really relate to a lot of the patients who, would say like, let's just get this over with, like this is the thing I have to do today. And we were coming at it from a different perspective. Like I wasn't, I didn't have the same kind of relationship around the disordered eating or the fear of the food, but I could really understand that idea of like, this is just something I have to check off my list today, and that's unpleasant, or whatever the case may be. So I think that maybe deepened some aspects of my empathy around those meal times with patients too.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think it does really feel like that for different reasons for people in various stages of their healing. I'm curious how your relationship with food changed then throughout the course of your adolescence. Like, how did you get from there to here to where you are now to doing this work?
I think a couple key things to point out. There's sort of two facets to it. One is that when I was about 14, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And at the time, I was very lucky in some ways that wellness culture and wellness discourses as diet culture kind of weren't circulating as pervasively as they are now. And so when I got that diagnosis, I didn't receive a lot of messaging around food restriction as treatment for Crohn's disease. And so I think having a chronic illness diagnosis like that, having to figure out what it meant as a younger person trying to reconcile, living with a degenerative disease was challenging and probably did impact some of my relationship with food. I spoke with my brother earlier today, and he reminded me, I kind of asked him what he remembered about our childhood. And he mentioned, he was like, around that time, I think you became a vegetarian. And I think that was some version of like trying to have control over something, because certain things in my life felt somewhat out of my control, which they were in a lot of ways. And I think mostly that diagnosis, though, really manifested in my relationship to my body and to what it deserved, what was wrong with it, to kind of go through puberty feeling like I had a diseased body, and B, a somewhat dysphoric body. I wasn't out as queer. I had no modeling for queerness or gender nonconformity at all, but I knew that there was something going on. And so those two things, really overlapped in my development. And so I think that was, we can kind of return to where I am now with that, my journey with that. But I think when it comes to how I entered into working in the way I do, I've listened to your podcast. I've worked in the eating disorder field for a really long time. And I have to say that I didn't come into working in the field and with the patients that I work with as someone in recovery with disordered eating. I certainly, there are moments that I can point to where maybe, I like the vegetarianism thing, I didn't take that to a very strong extreme. And so that was maybe an instance of trying to control something, but I was still nourishing myself quite significantly. And I smoked cigarettes, and that, impacted my appetite. And I thought that was cool for a little while, but I truly was, it was more like a way to fit in. And I truly was an athlete, and I needed to eat, and I wanted to be nourished. I liked the feeling of having enough food. And so again, I never really, and probably the thin privilege really, again, comes into it. No one was commenting on my body. The only times people commented on my body were, in regards to being an athlete and saying, like, you're strong, or you're doing a good job, or right. And so I can see how things could have gone very differently. So I didn't come into this field so much around that, but I did come into the field as someone who was really curious about the intersection of trauma and the body, and the ways in which people tend to find ways to manifest the emotional fallout, essentially, of trauma, and how even intergenerational trauma sort of manifests in the body. And so before I became a trained social worker, I had a job working in a residential treatment facility for people who had eating disorders, and also most of them had really significant trauma, many of whom were diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. And that experience really is what paved the way for the career that I have now. But I think the thing that resonated for me on a deeply personal level, and that made the work somewhat intuitive for me, even though I wasn't coming from a place of, being in recovery, or, I've had the same experience. I haven't restricted or binged in these certain ways, but I think what felt intuitive to me was a real kind of mutual recognition that, as Bessel van der Kolk would say, the body keeps the score, right? Like our bodies hold our trauma in various ways. And I knew that that was true of my body. And so I think that that's how the work started out, really kind of coming from a pretty intuitive place for me.
Yeah. How did you start to figure that out? How did you start to get in touch with your body?
Still working on it.
Endless project.
Yeah, really, truly endless. I mean, I think that it was, at that time, maybe like an intellectual idea or a kind of deep intuitive knowing that it felt important to listen to the stories of the people I was working with. Like, so for example, I really, to this day, I mean, have a very difficult time with exclusively behavioral treatments to treat eating disorders. And I was really interested in kind of drawing out or being curious about what the people I was working with had to say, what their stories were. And that felt incredibly important. I think that led me, I certainly wanted people to live and not die and survive and thrive. Of course, I was invested in kind of that recovery process and wanted people to feel nourished and be able to feel nourished. But I was really curious about the questions, like what gets in the way of feeling like you deserve nourishment? What gets in the way of relating to your body, as I did, and continue to do sometimes, as problematic, or as, I have a history with trauma that has impacted my body. I also live with a couple of autoimmune diseases that make me, or have made me, feel at various times like I have a diseased body. I have a body that doesn't function the right way, that something needs to be fixed, right? A very medicalized body. And I think those were kind of the points of overlap with the people, and continue to be the points of overlap with a lot of the people I work with. But I also related to this idea of really trying to find mechanisms for self-regulation. So for helping oneself, if you're dealing with dysphoria, which I was around my gender, understanding why a person would want to take certain steps so that they could present in a more prepubescent body, whereas that is typically like really pathologized, and it certainly is dangerous, but it made a lot of sense to me. So I think initially, and still to this day, I still bring a lot of curiosity to the people I'm working with, and myself as well. Why is this manifesting in this way? Like, why does your body feel some of the sensations feel inaccessible? Why is there a disconnect? What is the impact of trauma here? And I'm still unraveling that. It's part of, why I started my own podcast, is basically to talk to other people about how they are able to be in their bodies or not. I think I lived in my head a lot. And the only thing that really brought me back into my body was a confrontation with being sick. When I go through periods where I have, autoimmune flares, I then have to reckon with having a body, not just being a brain or a spirit or whatever,
I totally identify with what you're saying too about having autoimmune flares confront you with the reality of having a body and being in a body, and not just being a floating brain, because that has been an experience for me for a lot of my life as well. It's just this sort of hyper intellectual existence.
I mean, it's a survival. It like helps you survive, I mean, it's really, to this day, I still deal with the kind of grief that comes up when when I actually live from a place of acknowledging, the ways that my body may never feel. And that doesn't mean my body can't feel anything. It just means that my body has not been, quote unquote, perfected or optimized in the way that wellness culture tells us it can, or holds out that kind of carrot, a carrot stick of like, you can optimize yourself no matter what. If you have Crohn's disease, you can drink and it will go away. Like you will go into remission, and those are things that I've been hearing most of my life.
What was your experience with those things? Have you gone down the rabbit hole with some of them, tried some of those supposed cures? And
yes, I have gone into some deep holes. I would say, again, I feel grateful for this, and I just have never gone so far into a kind of restrictive place. Like there's something in me, and I'm not sure what. Maybe it is partly, the way I was, the food environment in which I was raised. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe the fact that I have a child and I need, I want to have a certain quality of life, and whatever the case may be, I feel like I have this kind of internal brake system where I start to, maybe restrict a few food groups because a naturopath or whoever recommends it, right? And then I start to become aware of the feeling that I'm actually restricting, like that something in my lifestyle feels very restricted, and I don't like that feeling. I don't want to model that feeling for my child or my patients, or, and so there's something that kind of stops me. But I will say that, initially it was very relieving to encounter sort of non-Western modalities for healing. I still have a lot of success with acupuncture and just for pain relief. And I think that when it comes to this question of inflammation, that is the real mind fuck. I have to say, when it comes to what non-Western wellness discourses more pervasively, I find it in acupuncture, physical therapy, chiropractic, massage, osteopath, I've done a lot of it, right? I think that when you have an autoimmune condition, and I clearly live with some levels of inflammation in my body pretty much at all times to varying degrees, it seems as if everyone has an answer for that. Everyone has a solution, usually food-based, usually restriction-based, to kind of counteract that. And part of the reason that I don't really talk very openly and publicly about my, the specificity of my chronic health issues is because I don't want unsolicited advice. And I've been to so many alternative practitioners who, I'm going to for a certain modality. All I want is to feel better. And so I'm vulnerable and I'm open to whatever they, are going to offer. And yet I often come away with this sense that there's a kind of moralizing around, your body could be rid of this inflammation. This inflammation is sort of an indicator that you aren't doing enough. And so here's more for you to do. You need to stop being stressed. And there's nothing like someone telling you, don't be stressed. It's like the elephant, don't look at the elephant in the room. It's like, don't be stressed or else you will get sick. And so that's one of them, stress. The other one is, restrict certain food groups. And when you're told to restrict certain food groups, it's not very frequently, it's not in the spirit of restrict certain food groups and really, nourish yourself with these things. It feels very much like restriction and deprivation and punishment. And so there's this kind of like punish your body into ceasing this inflammation process that you can then, purify your body and it can become more healthy. That's the version of health that is sold to me.
yeah, it's like this religious purification idea.
Doesn't help that I was raised Catholic. And so I kind of already have this, someone can really lock into those discourses pretty easily with me. But yes, you're right. It's very religious.
Yeah, it's like atone for the sin of your body, atone for the inflammatory sins that.
The inflammatory process. Exactly. I interviewed someone on my podcast, Jack Ferver, who's an amazing choreographer and dancer. And at one point, he said that anytime anyone would say anything about inflammation, it was like the thing he was living to avoid. And for for many people, we all have inflammation in our bodies, and all of these things that are being sold to kind of address that issue are often somehow in the spirit of restriction, or buying just an unbelievable amount of supplements. The supplements symbolically meaning your body is, deprived of all of these things. And let's take supplements, not let's eat food that has these, I think there's that too, the kind of like adding in things that your body is needing. And which is not to say that sometimes people are deficient in certain, or that I've never been, deficient in certain vitamins or minerals, but that's often bears out in medical blood testing with a medical doctor, not a skin prick food allergy test at a naturopath's office.
Yeah. And it's really interesting too to think about how much of a panacea this idea of reducing inflammation supposedly is. It's like, it's the one key.
So compelling.
It's so compelling. And I feel like over the years and the centuries, there's always been that one thing, that magic bullet that has been sold to us. And inflammation is just the latest one. It's like within the last probably 15 or 20 years, that's started to become part of the discourse. And especially within the last like 5 or 10 years, it's like the bête noire of the alternative medicine world. It's like inflammation, inflammation, inflammation. And you're right that it's always framed as this thing to be purified by restriction. There's this real ascetic quality to it. And it really is so similar in a lot of ways to like the language of religion and discourses around removing this thing, like removing sin from your life, or removing, the things that don't work by atonement, by sacrifice and giving things up. And, it's so counter to what we actually know about these diseases, autoimmune conditions. And I have autoimmune conditions myself too, and have totally been down that rabbit hole as well of trying to cut out a million things to see if it was going to make any difference. And also did a lot of scientific research on it, deep diving into like PubMed and stuff on this issue because it was so fascinating to me, and finding that there's just so much we still don't know about autoimmune disorders. And what we do know seems to be really counter to what a lot of the alternative medicine world is preaching. This panacea idea of like cut out these certain foods to reduce your inflammation really isn't borne out by the science, which is so much messier and so much earlier stage and so much more contradictory. And that, when it comes to especially things like gluten and dairy, which I know we've both had experiences of cutting out and being told to cut out, or thinking that we should cut out because of autoimmune conditions, like there really isn't good evidence that people need to do that unless they already have a pre-existing condition that makes them react to those foods, like celiac disease. It's very true that people with celiac who have other autoimmune conditions, when they are eating gluten, it seems to exacerbate their other autoimmune conditions. And when they are not eating gluten, it seems to help. But that's because people with celiac have a problem with gluten genetically anyway. And, same with like people who have casein intolerance, which is a very rare condition that makes people unable to digest the protein in milk. That maybe that would also lead to outbreaks of eczema or things like that are not anything really to do with, it's like if you're reacting to something that your body is not meant to digest or process, then of course there's probably going to be some other sort of symptoms and things that crop up. But for the vast, vast, vast majority of people who, we're talking like a low single digit or even below, well, really for both of those things, it's like less than 1% of the population has them. So the rest of us, the 99.9% of us who have other things, I think it's we're getting so lumped in with the information that's out there about, like, yes, for people with celiac, cutting out gluten really helps with these other autoimmune conditions. Any sort of alternative medicine or even Western medicine practitioner who is using that as justification to say someone with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, like I have, cut out gluten, cut out dairy, or someone with Crohn's disease, cut out gluten. It's just not there. The justification really isn't there in the science. And it's really a misreading of that science to kind of paint with a broad brush and say that everyone should avoid this thing that, 0.75% of the population actually really needs to avoid. It's so frustrating and so confusing, I think, when you're someone who is in pain and struggling to make sense of your body and get some help and relief. It's so tempting, and it's so easy to fall into that trap of cutting out foods and doing what you've been told, but oftentimes really does lead down this rabbit hole of disorder, for a lot of folks, and myself included. It's like it just, that restriction begets more restriction and begets binging and begets so much chaos in your relationship with food and your body that then it starts to feel like, oh, I need to cut out more stuff because I'm feeling worse and I'm feeling bad. So it must be that there's other foods I need to cut out, and that, that I'm bad somehow for not managing my inflammation adequately.
Yeah, exactly. It's somehow that the inflammation is, or the evidence or the manifestation of disease is an indicator that you haven't done enough. I mean, I think something like orthorexia, which is pretty much common across the board with many of my patients that I have and continue to work with, is something that feels similar to this, or it's obviously adjacent to or intertwined with this conversation we're having. But it's this idea that, there's always more you can do. You can always, if it's not this, if this isn't working, then you do this. I've been told to make sure I'm always doing like daily, and at times I'm, it's just like, that's the absolute thing that my body, I'm pretty sure, doesn't need right now.
Right.
There's the like, when I'm not feeling well, but there is this kind of seduction, I think, around being able to do and act and intervene in something that has been deemed a problematic or diseased body. And that goes also for bodies that are, queer and trans and gender nonconforming, and that so often those bodies are deemed problematic, or they need to be fixed or adjusted, or, put in one category of a binary or the other, and become more legible in the world. And that also brings a tremendous amount of pressure to kind of do this fixing or do this intervening upon a body that is deemed somehow inappropriate or deviant.
As you were talking about that, it also strikes me how much religion and patriarchy and these structures and systems are also in play, telling people that their body is wrong if it is outside this mythic norm, outside the supposed ideal of binary, cisgender, straight, able-bodied, young, like white, all of the other stuff. And yeah, I'm curious to hear about your experience of coming into your queer identity and your non-binary identity, and sort of how that played into your relationship with your body. And I love that your podcast is called Living in This Queer Body. And we were talking earlier about the difficulty of like living in your body and being in your body. So it's like, it seems like that's a really fruitful project, an interesting project to be continuing to look at what it means to live in this queer body.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's an ongoing challenge, I would say, to live in this particular queer body. And I think it is for many people, for various reasons. And, so many of the people I work with also, a lot of the work we do is sort of around that question of how do I have one patient that, we say this to, I say this to them quite frequently. It's like, can you bring your body along when you go and do this thing, right? Can you bring, because it's so painful sometimes to integrate a body that does feel somewhat dysphoric or deviant or sick or differently abled or whatever the case may be, to kind of be aware of that as you're moving through the world. And I think that for me, being more out as queer, as non-binary, as kind of just the weirdo person that I am. I have a daughter. I gave birth. I have done a lot of things that are kind of, complicated around the binary of what it means to be assigned female at birth. And so I think the more I've accepted that and like leaned into that, I think that relieves a lot of the emotional tension actually that does affect how I feel. And the same goes, I guess, for my identity, or my, maybe not identity, but just my growing acceptance of the complicated health journey. I don't usually like that that phrase health journey, but like that, the kind of journey I'm on in terms of my autoimmune process. Like sometimes there's absolutely nothing I can do to intervene in the process of my body being sick for a while, and that fighting against that through these kind of orthorexic wellness discourse, suggestions or prescriptions really has impacted the ease with which I kind of relate to my body, instead of looking at it or experiencing it as something that is deserving of care and nourishment and gentleness. It's kind of a punitive relationship. And that's an ongoing process to kind of notice when I'm relating to myself in that way, and to try to make a decision. I think to do things differently. It's very helpful having a child, having a daughter, to kind of think about, like, would I ever think of asking her to treat herself this way? Never, right? And so that's been an interesting modeling or learning having a younger kid in my life. But yeah, I think that surrounding myself with other people who are not only accepting but interested in the way I am, and I think that's a lot of what my podcast is having conversations with people who are interesting and exciting and complicated and queer and weird and strange and challenging a lot of these limiting discourses. That has been actually quite helpful for me.
I love the idea of starting to accept yourself as a person with chronic illness that might always be ebbing and flowing, and that opening up to that is providing relief. And I have found the same to be true for myself.
You have?
Yeah, for sure. Like when I was so obsessed about making my Hashimoto's disease go away, basically, like getting off medication and all that stuff, I was driving myself to distraction all the time, but with all of these food restrictions and diving down internet rabbit holes and spending all this time on these message boards and all of it, and going to different doctors and trying to figure out what was wrong with me, because I mean, also when this was happening, it was like my disordered eating was just ramping up and up and up. And it had already been that, like, I was already really disordered with food when I was first diagnosed with Hashimoto's. And there's some evidence that it may, like, that starvation can actually be a trigger for it. That, I definitely had a genetic predisposition to it. My mom has it. I knew that it was out there as a possibility, but I think, for that particular time in my life, for it to come on, who knows, the stress of the restriction could have definitely played a role, in the stress of the overexercise as well. So I was like already disordered, and then got this diagnosis, which made me then even more, obsessed and orthorexic, and trying to figure out what was the solution and what was the problem and what foods to cut out to stop it. And that worsened my symptoms or prolonged the other symptoms that were happening that didn't actually have anything to do with the Hashimoto's really, but like missing my period and having, lots of fatigue even when I was finally on the right dose of medication, and digestive issues and all this stuff, that I was trying to find something to blame it on. And the search for something to blame it on was like a search for, a way to perfect myself, really, because if I could find the thing to blame, then I could find the solution and I could make myself not bad anymore, right? I could atone.
Yes.
Yeah. Just giving up that project of perfection and of saying, like, I'm going to atone for this supposed sin that my body has given me, this autoimmune condition, and just allowing and accepting for the fact that, like, sometimes, most of those other symptoms have gone away because I'm not disordered with food anymore. So there's that piece too. But then there's the thing of, like, with the Hashimoto's, there's going to be times when I'm fatigued. There's going to be times when I'm having breakouts or having eczema flare-ups and things like that maybe have to do with needing to tweak my medication, because sometimes my needs will go up and I won't recognize that for a while. And there'll be a few months of, like, oh God, why am I so tired? It must be burnt out. And then it's like, oh, it's actually your levels are off. Let's go up in dose, or let's tweak your dose or whatever. Sometimes it's been too high and I've been like, why can't I sleep? I'm so stressed out all the time. And turns out it's whatever my body is doing, making its own thyroid has decided to do more. And so then I need less of the medication. So there's always this sort of balancing act. But if I can kind of treat that with grace and compassion and maybe some level of humor, and just be open to it as something that my body is always going to be navigating, rather than like something is wrong with my body and I need to find the solution, and the solution is going to be this, like, permanent thing, and then I'll never have another problem.
Exactly. Like I've transcended this disease and I'm in remission. Like that word remission. I mean, that is, that is actually something that happens to some people with certain medical conditions, thankfully. I mean, that's great. But there are certain conditions, where it's just that's a really complicated goal. I think, as you were talking, I was remembering when I first discovered, which wasn't that long ago, actually, when I first discovered really what this kind of concept of healthism is, and some of the writing about healthism. And a lot of what resonated for me is just that it's truly like a moralizing around quote unquote health, right? So a quote unquote healthy body, right? Usually cisgendered, white, thin, non-diseased body is morally superior to another kind of body. And there's an assumption that it's just like the moralizing of thinness versus being in a larger body or being fat. It's embedded in that is so much implicit shame around what it means to have a body that deviates from that very limited norm. And I think that that's something that, as I run workshops and really work with people, it's been a kind of shockingly impactful set of discussions. There's so many people across the country who have come into my workshops who have stockpiles of supplements that they are just plagued by and desperate to just get rid of, because they've tried everything and they still have, whatever. They still have fatigue. They still have some symptoms that are difficult in their lives, but that they've spent so much time kind of attacking themselves fundamentally for whatever is manifesting in their bodies. And sometimes that does have its origins in a kind of traumatic experience or intergenerational trauma or a particular disease process. But that idea of really turning on oneself and thinking that a strict adherence to a really restrictive wellness regimen is going to produce some kind of consistent, sustainable, pure body, like a goopified body, right?
Right.
And I relate to that idea, but it's been really impactful to see how many folks, particularly queer and non-binary, trans, people of color, and disabled folks, really have just been tortured actually by these discourses. I mean, I know you talk about that in your book, and the wellness diet is, the wellness discourses are the new diet culture. And it's really hurting people.
It really is. And I mean, as you were talking too, I was thinking about the history of diet culture and the fact that this sort of wellness thread has always been a part of the root system of diet culture from, the 1800s on. Like Sylvester Graham was one of the early diet, maybe arguably the first like wellness guru really in this country, who was a Presbyterian minister who had gone through really significant trauma as a child, like, stuff that you could assume that trauma would be living in his body and be affecting his physical being for, decades to come after that, like had a really rough go of it. And as people often do, I think, especially today, but, he was kind of the first like high profile person to do this. I think in those situations, you want a solution, you want some relief. And I think also being Presbyterian, sort of puritanical, having those values, being close to like the Puritan history of Protestantism in this country. He was very concerned about morality and sort of modern life taking us away from godliness and the supposed purity of life, before industrialization started to come on the scene. And so his solution was like taking out foods, taking out the foods that he deemed hyper-stimulating. And there was a lot of other stuff too, like reducing the amount of sex that married couples had, or stopping masturbation, or like all this sort of sexual policing stuff. But it was really this idea of like purification through abstinence on various levels, right? And abstaining from even like condiments and spicy foods and anything that he deemed too stimulating. And he had a huge following, and this like really set the stage for a lot of the diet culture stuff that came next in our culture. And I just think about that as the roots of this modern day stuff, right? Where it's like people who've gone through the trauma of marginalization or the trauma of chronic illness and having to deal with that, and the sort of layers of stigma that are heaped upon people in those situations. Of course it's going to be painful. Of course it's going to be difficult to be a person whose body is deemed deviant or wrong in some way. But then the supposed solution is just heaping more pain and also personal responsibility discourse on top of which there's research showing that framing body size as a matter of personal responsibility increases weight stigma in the people who are exposed to that framing. And I'm sure I'm not as familiar with disability literature or literature on like the stigma of chronic illness, but I'm sure that is true around framing disability and chronic illness as a person's personal responsibility too. There's got to be physical impact of that creates stress on the body. And so, telling people that it's your responsibility to fix it through $90 jade eggs that you put in your vagina, or these weird concoctions that you're supposed to drink or whatever, is completely entrenching the problem. It's just making it more of a personal responsibility, therefore creating more stigma on the person that is already going through something in the first place that's difficult.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the personal responsibility discourse is so prevalent, and it also makes me think about my work in the mental health field and the way in which certain diagnoses are so deeply pathologized and also often have their origins in severe trauma, and that there's some kind of idea that someone who has a particular kind of, inborn resilience or purity about them can transcend severely traumatic experiences unscathed, right? There'd be no manifestation in the body. And if there is, then that is of the person's responsibility to eliminate that impact. Whereas, something my therapist just said to me the other day was, my own therapist said to me the other day was that, and I believe this too, and I certainly have said this and feel this about some of my patients, is that, trauma does impact the body, and it fundamentally does. And that doesn't make that impact a person's fault or something that they have to fix. And I think a lot of these positive affirmational wellness discourses really promote this idea that, it's your responsibility to eliminate negativity or eliminate nervous system dysregulation from your body. And it's, as someone who's worked in this field for quite some time, it takes a lot of work to address a body system and a nervous system that has been traumatized and dysregulated. And the kind of things that, if you think about your nervous system as like a little child, you wouldn't speak punitively to a little child that's upset. You would, hug the child and put them somewhere warm and cozy and nice. And I think that, you wouldn't say it's your responsibility that you feel sad or upset. And I think that there's a lot of discourses. I mean, I trying to think of something particular that comes to mind, but I do think that kind of personal responsibility discourse is really pervasive right now, and only further entrenches, as you said, kind of only further entrenches the kind of tension and pain that is experienced in people's bodies, which then only leads to kind of more dissociative behaviors because it's too painful to kind of be with it. So I think if anything, I've learned, back to what we were talking about earlier, I've learned that as much as I can be in my problematic body, quote unquote problematic, right? Be in my body that is sometimes quote unquote sick or well, or more energized or less energized. The more I can just be in it and be with it, the better I feel because I'm not fighting myself.
Yeah. Well, and when you gave that example of, we wouldn't talk to a child who's upset like that. It is the difference between that self-compassion, of like taking care of the child who's sad and teaching them that it's okay to be sad and giving them hugs and love and comfort and the tools to help themselves through moments of sadness when they get older and are doing it on their own, versus unfortunately, the parenting strategy that I think a lot of folks encounter, which is parents who are punitive and who are shaming of the natural feelings and cycles that we go through as kids, and say, basically, suck it up, or like, stop crying, crying is for wimps, or whatever it is, And I think that type of punitive relationship with ourselves can often carry over and really does carry over culturally too, into like how we perceive illness and bodies that just aren't functioning the way that we're told they should function, and just really does worsen the problem, versus self-compassion. If we can start relating to ourselves in that way that is more compassionate, the way that ideally all of us would have been parented, and that we can learn to reparent ourselves, even though it takes a lot of work. That self-compassion has actually been shown to have a lot of positive benefits, a lot of positive effects on health and well-being. And I think it's for people who are like newer to this work and just coming in to listening to this podcast, I think it can sometimes surprise people to hear me and my guests talk about that health is not a matter of personal responsibility, and that this personal responsibility discourse is so problematic and harmful and worsens our health outcomes. But the truth really is that if we can stop seeing it as a matter of control and responsibility, but more as a matter of care and compassion, that frame shift, even though there might be some similar things that we do to take care of ourselves in that compassionate lens, it's not this, it's your fault if you're not doing this. It's, hey, here's some things and some practices that might help you feel better. And, you can choose from among these to the extent that you're capable of, or you can also just like choose to have a good cry, or just take some extra naps while you're feeling bad. And like, that's whatever you need to do for yourself is okay.
And also, I think, I agree with everything you said. And the other thing though that comes to mind that sort of feels complicated is that sometimes what feels good, quote unquote, or soothing is, thinking about kind of disordered eating and a lot of the people I've worked with, restriction feels good and it feels bad. It feels good in the sense that, maybe if you've experienced a tremendous amount of trauma, it can be, or a tremendous amount of pain in your body, it can feel somehow it is your best attempt to soothe yourself. And that's where the kind of like little child metaphor kind of comes into play. Maybe you can't nourish and soothe yourself on your own. Maybe you need help. Maybe you need, a team or a health at every size, hopefully trained dietitian or a therapist who can help you kind of shift into different practices that also could help you soothe and feel good. But I think so much of particularly like eating disorder recovery discourses are so much about, this kind of like, let's attack the eating disorder inside of you, this like wild beast that has taken over this, pure body or whatever. And I've going back to what I said earlier, I think it's so important to be curious. Of course, we need to be concerned about people's, ultimate well-being. And if someone is in danger, we have to address that right away in terms of medically stable and all of that. But, I do think it's really important to be curious and try to understand, like, what does it feel like when you are in a binge restriction cycle? Like, what is that doing for you emotionally? Just trying to understand the nuance of that a bit more. And that's certainly the case. I mean, really profoundly, certainly the case with a lot of my patients who would not, or a lot of the people I've, historically worked with who don't even identify explicitly as having an eating disorder, but identify as trans or non-binary and have been restricting or binging as long as they can remember, because that is the form of regulation that has helped them to feel connected to a kind of more desirable body or gender expression. And so we can't do it on our own sometimes, and we need other people to help us, and we need other people to be curious about why, kind of to help us untangle, and myself included, help us untangle from some of these discourses you and I have been discussing, like the, self-responsibility discourse. I needed other people to help me untangle, and continue to need other people to help me untangle myself when I get sort of trapped in that. And it's an ongoing process. And the work you're doing on the podcast and the work I'm doing with my therapist, and, all of these things are helpful in that regard.
Yeah, that's such a great point, that it really is difficult to tell sometimes what is like a positive coping mechanism and what's a coping mechanism that has some benefits, but also has long-term harm and damage, potential to damage your well-being. So I think we really need other people's perspectives to help us see that, and other people too, to model that self-compassion and model the discernment between, okay, what disordered eating practices are giving you in the moment versus what their long-term outcomes are, and how to parent yourself and be compassionate with yourself through the process of recovery while choosing something different that's actually going to feel really uncomfortable at first and not.
Yes, exactly. It's not going to feel good, right?
It's going to feel really hard. And like you were saying before about meal times feeling like a chore for the people that are in eating disorder treatment, it's true that, it's going to feel like, okay, like this is a real slog. I'm trying to do the right thing to, help my body heal and help myself feel better. And it actually it feels like just going through the motions at first, or it feels like doing something that's very foreign and new and different and kind of like homework or kind of like rote learning that doesn't feel natural.
Yeah, I think my version of that is sitting with myself when my body is, is symptomatic or I'm having more of a flare, sitting with myself as opposed to running all over town trying to find a practitioner that is going to make it go away, which doesn't mean that I don't need people, but it doesn't feel comfortable to sit with that pain. But the more I sit with and accept and learn to be more easeful with it, it does become easier, the same way that after some really awful, terrible, boring meals that you can't even taste and can't even feel, you start to actually be able to taste and feel and have preference and all of those things that come along with recovery.
Yeah, it's a practice, and it's a it's a tough one for sure. And I think, we're so ingrained and conditioned in our culture to want to look for solutions when we feel bad. And we're so ingrained also to want to eat in a disordered way because there's so much cultural praise for that, and sometimes internal validation that comes from that too, because not just of internalized weight stigma, although that's often a big piece of it, but also like you said, for people who are trans and non-binary who don't really have the language or the are not in a place to like be out about that or accepting of that. It's like a way to kind of feel less dysphoric. And that's a tricky thing, because of course you deserve to feel less dysphoric. Of course you deserve to feel more at home in your body. And like there's different ways to do that don't involve hurting yourself.
Correct. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love this conversation. I feel like we can talk for like another hour and a half about all of this stuff, but
yeah,
I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So thank you so much for sharing all that you did. And can you tell us where people can find you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, I will. Thank you too. And thanks for everything you do. I feel like we're collaborators in some of these efforts. So I appreciate that. Yeah, people can find me. I'm basically on Instagram and my website. So Instagram is Living in This Queer Body, all one phrase. And my website is livinginThisQueerBody.com.
Easy.
Yeah. And that's where I post all of my workshops and where you can listen to my podcast. And you can also listen to my podcast anywhere else too, like anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Yeah, wherever you're listening to this, if you just type in Living in This Queer Body in the search, it should come up right away. So,
and we have some overlap between people we've interviewed. So that's fun too.
I know, totally. I was looking through your list of people recently and we're like, oh my gosh, this is great. Yeah. Well, I'll put links to that in the show notes so people can find it. And thank you again so much, Asher. This was great talking.
Thank you too.
So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Asher Pandjiris for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe and share at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/246. That's christyharrison.com/246. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode of Food Psych was brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it now. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.